A little girl tugged at Karoline's sleeve, pointed at her cross necklace, and asked a question so simple yet so powerful, it brought tears to her eyes. The community center in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, buzzed with life. The scent of fresh brewed coffee and warm pastries hung in the air, mixing with the chatter of townspeople who had gathered for the evening's meet and greet. It was the kind of place where neighbors still knew each other by name, where life slowed down just enough for people to truly connect. Karoline Leavitt stood near a folding table stacked with pamphlets, smiling as she shook hands and answered questions. She had always enjoyed events like these, not for the attention, but for the conversations. The real, unfiltered stories people shared with her. The quiet moments of honesty that reminded her why she did what she did. As she chatted with an older woman about local schools, she felt a light tug at her sleeve. At first she thought nothing of it, but the tug came again. Persistent, small. She turned, glancing down. A little girl stood there, barely 7 years old, with chestnut curls that framed her round, freckled face. She clutched the hem of her floral dress. Her wide brown eyes locked on Karoline's necklace. Karoline crouched down, leveling herself with the child. "Hey there," she said softly, offering a warm smile. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then answered just as quietly, "Samantha." "Well, it's nice to meet you, Samantha." The child's gaze didn't waver. Instead, she pointed a small, slightly trembling finger at the delicate gold cross resting against Karoline's collarbone. "What does your necklace mean?" The room around them didn't go silent, not really. But to Karoline, the air shifted. The question was simple, innocent, and yet it carried a weight she hadn't expected. For years, that cross had rested against her skin, close to her heart. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a reminder, a marker of something bigger than herself. And for the first time in a long time, someone was asking her to explain it. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, her mind took her somewhere else, back to a night she had spent years trying to forget. But some memories don't fade, no matter how much you wish they would. Karoline blinked, still kneeling before the little girl, but her mind was elsewhere. Years in the past, in a moment that had shaped her in ways she never imagined. She had been 19, just a freshman at Belmont University in Nashville, excited about her future but struggling more than she let on. Back then, she was trying to balance classes, 2 part-time jobs, and the nagging feeling that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong. Her parents had always raised her in faith, but in that season of her life, it felt distant. She went through the motions, Sunday services, whispered prayers before bed, but it all felt hollow, like she was speaking into an empty room. Then the phone call came. It was just after midnight, the dorm room dimly lit by the glow of her laptop screen. She had been cramming for an exam when her phone vibrated. She almost didn't answer, but something told her she should. The moment she heard her mother's voice, she knew. Her grandmother, the woman who had taught her how to bake biscuits from scratch, who always smelled like lavender and spoke about faith like it was as real as the ground beneath their feet, was gone. A sudden heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. Karoline barely remembered the next few hours. She only recalled the quiet sobs of her roommate in the background, the icy numbness in her chest, and the suffocating weight of realizing she would never hear her grandmother's voice again. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. The next morning, she went through the motions, packed a bag, booked a bus ticket home, but her hands felt disconnected from her body, like she was watching someone else live her life. When she arrived at her childhood home, everything felt wrong. Her grandmother's chair sat empty. The air felt heavy, thick with things left unsaid. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered into her grandmother's bedroom. The scent of lavender still lingered, clinging to the blankets and pillows. On the nightstand, a single object caught her eye, a delicate gold chain, the cross pendant resting against the worn pages of a Bible. Her grandmother had worn that necklace every day of her life. Karoline picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. Something about it stopped her in her tracks. The weight of it in her palm felt different, like it wasn't just jewelry, but something more. Something she wasn't ready to understand yet. But sometimes, faith finds you before you're ready for it. Karoline stood in the dim light of her grandmother's bedroom, clutching the cross necklace so tightly that the edges pressed into her palm. She expected to feel comfort, but instead she felt anger, How could God take someone like her grandmother, someone so full of love, so steady in her faith, and leave Karoline here, drowning in questions she didn't know how to answer? She had heard people talk about finding peace in loss, about trusting that everything happens for a reason, but that night, none of it made sense. She slipped the chain over her head anyway, letting the pendant rest against her chest. It was cold at first, unfamiliar. Then, as if the weight of it suddenly became too much to bear, she broke down. Tears came hard and fast, shaking her entire body as she sank onto the bed. It wasn't quiet, dignified crying. It was the kind of grief that rips through you, leaving you raw, breathless. She curled into herself, pressing her forehead against the fabric of her grandmother's quilt, the scent of lavender still clinging to it. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, but at some point she whispered, maybe to herself, maybe to God, if he was even listening, "If you're real, if you're really out there, I need to know. I need to feel something, anything, because right now I feel nothing at all." The silence that followed was deafening. No voice from the heavens, no sudden burst of warmth or clarity, just the distant hum of crickets outside the window and the occasional creak of the old house settling. She should have felt foolish. She should have gotten up, wiped her face, and told herself to move on. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed there, waiting. And then, something happened. It wasn't a voice or a vision, not the kind of thing you read about in storybooks. It was something smaller, a shift, barely noticeable but unmistakable. Her heart, which had felt like it was tearing itself apart moments before, slowed. The tightness in her chest didn't disappear, but it loosened just a little. Her breathing, ragged and uneven, steadied. And somewhere deep inside, where only she could feel it, a whisper of warmth settled into the coldest parts of her. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a solution. But it was something. For the first time since she had picked up the phone that night, she wasn't drowning anymore. She pulled the cross necklace between her fingers, staring at it through tear-blurred vision. It had belonged to her grandmother, but somehow in that moment, it felt like it had found her instead. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if her faith would ever feel the way it had when she was a child, unquestioning and easy. But she knew one thing. She wasn't alone. And that was enough to keep going. But faith isn't a single moment. It's a journey. And sometimes the hardest part is taking the next step. The days after her grandmother's passing felt like moving through water, slow, heavy, uncertain. Karoline went through the motions, offering small smiles to relatives who patted her shoulder, nodding along to condolences that all blurred together. But something was different now. She still had questions, still felt that ache in her chest when she thought about the finality of it all. But every time she reached for the delicate cross resting against her collarbone, she felt steadier. She returned to Belmont a week later, stepping off the bus with a heart that wasn't quite healed, but wasn't completely shattered either. She had expected the loneliness to crash over her again, but instead, there was something else. A quiet strength. One night about a month later, Karoline was sitting in the student lounge, flipping through pages of a textbook without really reading them. A classmate named Brandon, someone she barely knew outside of shared lectures, sat across from her, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "You okay?" she asked. At first he didn't answer. Then with a shaky breath he whispered, "My dad died last night." Karoline froze. She should have said, "I'm so sorry," or, "That must be really hard." But those words felt thin, like they could slip through the cracks of his grief and disappear. Instead, she reached for her necklace, rubbing the pendant between her fingers the way she had done 100 times since that night in her grandmother's bedroom. "I lost my grandma last month," she admitted. "I don't have the right words for this kind of thing, but I know how it feels to think nothing will ever make sense again." Brandon swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as he blinked rapidly. "Yeah." She hesitated, then took off the necklace and held it out to him, his brows knitted together. I can't take that." "You're not taking it," she said softly. "Just borrowing it. Until you feel like you can breathe again." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her like she had given him something much bigger than a piece of jewelry. Then, with shaking hands, he took it. Karoline didn't know it then, but that moment, that small act of kindness, would be the first of many. Because sometimes faith isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it's just about showing up when someone else is too lost to find their own way. But faith has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Karoline's voice softened as she brought herself back to the present, back to the little girl standing in front of her, wide-eyed and silent. She could still feel the weight of that moment years ago, of handing over something that had once been her own anchor, hoping it would help someone else stay afloat. She glanced down at the delicate cross around her neck now, the one she had bought to replace the one she had given away. But that first necklace, the one that had belonged to her grandmother, never made its way back to her. Brandon had kept it. A year after she had lent it to him, he had told her he wasn't ready to give it back yet. She had just smiled and told him, "Then it's yours." And now, years later, here she was, being asked a question by a little girl who had no idea how much that small piece of gold had shaped her life. Karoline took a steady breath. "My grandmother gave me a necklace just like this," she said, her fingers grazing the cross. "At first I thought it was just jewelry, something pretty to wear. But after she passed, I realized it was something much bigger than that. It reminded me that even when I felt alone, I never really was." The little girl's eyes flickered with something Karoline recognized. A quiet understanding, a familiarity beyond her years. "My mom used to wear one," the girl whispered. Her tiny fingers reached up to her own neck where there was nothing but bare skin. "She had to sell it. She said we needed food more than jewelry." Karoline's chest tightened. She didn't need to ask where the girl's mother was now. She could already sense the answer in the way the child's voice trembled. She didn't hesitate. With careful hands, she reached behind her neck, unclasping the chain. The little girl's eyes widened as Karoline took her hand and gently placed the necklace in her palm. "It's yours now," Karoline said softly. The girl stared at the cross, her lip trembling. "But I can't." "Yes, you can," Karoline interrupted with a gentle smile. "And whenever you wear it, I want you to remember that no matter what happens, you're never alone." The little girl's fingers curled around the necklace as tears welled in her eyes. A quiet sob escaped her throat as she launched herself forward, wrapping her small arms around Karoline's neck. Karoline held her close, feeling the girl's tiny frame shake against her. Somewhere in the background, the murmurs of the crowd had gone silent. The weight of the moment settled over the room, thick with something unspoken, something sacred. But sometimes the most powerful moments don't need words at all. The little girl held on to Karoline for what felt like an eternity. When she finally pulled away, she wiped at her damp cheeks with the back of her hand, her fingers still curled protectively around the necklace. Karoline could see the emotions flickering across her young face. Gratitude, disbelief, something unspoken that only a child who had seen too much too soon could understand. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her hands trembling slightly. Karoline knew before she even spoke. This was the girl's mother. I don't know what to say," the woman murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Her eyes, weary but kind, flickered between Karoline and her daughter. "She talks about that necklace every night before bed. The one I had to sell. I never thought she'd have another one." Karoline smiled gently. "Now she does." The mother swallowed hard, her lips pressing together as she exhaled shakily. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." But Karoline knew exactly what it meant, because she had once been on the other side of that moment, the one receiving something that felt like hope, when hope was the hardest thing to hold on to. The crowd, which had been so still, so silent, began to shift. Some people wiped their eyes, others exchanged quiet glances. A few older women pressed hands over their hearts, nodding as if they understood something without needing to say it out loud. Then, something unexpected happened. A man in the back stepped forward. He was tall, his clothes slightly worn, his hands calloused from a lifetime of work. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small wad of cash, and placed it gently in the mother's hand. "For groceries," he said simply. The mother gasped, shaking her head. "Oh, I can't—" "Please," he interrupted, his voice steady but kind. "It's not charity. It's just the right thing to do." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Someone else stepped forward, offering a gift card for a local grocery store. Another woman pulled a small bracelet from her wrist and handed it to the little girl, whispering, "Something pretty to go with your necklace." One by one, kindness rippled through the room, each person giving what they could, small, quiet gestures that might not have seemed like much on their own, but together, they became something powerful. Karoline took a step back, watching as strangers became something more than just faces in a crowd. This wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. It was about something bigger, something that had started with a simple question from a little girl. Because sometimes, faith isn't just about belief. Sometimes it's about action. But the most powerful moments don't just happen. They leave something behind, something that lingers long after the moment itself is gone. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Karoline stood there for a moment, watching the little girl clutch the necklace tightly against her chest. The mother held her daughter's hand, her eyes still wet with unshed tears, whispering something only they could hear. It was a simple exchange, barely noticeable amidst the quiet murmurs of the room, but Karoline knew this moment would stay with them forever. And if she was honest, it would stay with her too. She had walked into this community center expecting nothing more than a handshake, a few conversations, and maybe some polite applause. Instead, she had been reminded of something she had learned years ago. The smallest moments often hold the most weight. That little girl didn't know it, but she had given Karoline something just as meaningful in return. She had reminded her why faith mattered, why kindness, especially the kind that asked for nothing in return, was worth everything. She had once thought faith was about having all the answers. That night in her grandmother's bedroom, she had begged for one, just one clear, undeniable sign. But as she got older, she realized something. Faith isn't about knowing. It's about trusting. Trusting that even in the hardest moments, even when the answers don't come easily, there is still light to be found. And sometimes, that light comes in the form of a small hand tugging at your sleeve. Karoline exhaled, feeling an unexpected warmth settle in her chest. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she felt another tug on her sleeve. The little girl was looking up at her again, her fingers still curled around the cross. "Miss Karoline?" she asked softly. Karoline crouched down once more. "Yeah, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, then said, "I think my mom's right. You gave me more than a necklace." Karoline smiled. "And you gave me more than a question." The little girl beamed, then turned, running back to her mother. Karoline watched them go, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She didn't know what struggles lay ahead for that little girl, or for her mother. She couldn't promise them that life would always be easy. But what she could do, what they all could do, was make sure no one ever felt alone in their journey. And sometimes, all it took was a simple act of kindness. She turned back toward the exit, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sky was painted in hues of deep blues and soft oranges, the first stars flickering to life above. As she walked toward her car, she glanced down at the spot where her necklace had rested just hours ago. It was gone, but somehow she had never felt more whole. Some moments stay with us forever. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a kind word, a simple gift, a moment of understanding, can change a life. So the next time you have the chance to show kindness, take it. You never know whose heart might need it the most. And if this story touched you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Pass it on. Be someone's light in their darkest moment. If you want to hear more stories that matter, make sure to subscribe. Because the best stories, they're the ones that remind us of who we truly are.